This is Lockie, a happy, fun-loving 3-year-old. Life can be unpredictable. You never know what's going to get thrown at you and how you'll react under pressure. You can either let it break you or try your best to turn a horrible situation into something positive. Looking at that smiling face, it's easy to forget how horrible things were for him. You expect to face some challenges in your life, but we certainly weren't expecting what happened. This is our story. This is my family. My wife Shannon on the left, and that guy on the right, that's me. Most people call me Charlie. And you've already met our son Lockie. Lockie was born November 2015. He was a happy, healthy baby, and for both of us, as cliched as it was love at first sight. Right back from when we first met, fell in love, and got married, there was always something in the back of our minds. You see, Shan has a family history of haemophilia, and we knew if we were to ever have children, it was something that we had to think about.
When I found out I was pregnant, we were both really optimistic. We were both hoping that we'd either have a girl or a boy that didn't have haemophilia. In saying that, I was still very nervous the whole pregnancy. We just waited until that 20-week scan to find out if we were having a boy or a girl. Then we had to wait again after that to find out which side of the coin we'd get.
But what is haemophilia?
That's an excellent question, Lockie. Haemophilia is an inherited genetic bleeding disorder in which a person's blood does not clot properly. Clotting factors help our blood clot, and people with bleeding disorders are either missing these or have very low levels. Most cases are hereditary, however, about a third are new cases due to a spontaneous genetic mutation. While there is treatment, there is no cure, and people have these conditions for life. Haemophilia is passed from parent to child on the X chromosome, meaning there's a 50% chance of a woman's male babies having haemophilia and their female babies carrying the gene. As males with haemophilia have the affected X chromosome, all of their female children will be carriers, but their male children will be unaffected. Although rare, women can be carriers and also have haemophilia, which is the case in our family. The severity of haemophilia is determined by the percentage of clotting factor in the blood and can be either mild, moderate or severe.
When Lockie was born, we found out he had mild haemophilia A. We were assured that because it was mild, we shouldn't really have too many problems, and with the treatments the way they are today, he would live a long and happy life.
Up until the 1960s, haemophilia was treated with large amounts of whole blood, which was not ideal. Treatment today is much more effective. Synthetic factor replacement is infused into the bloodstream, often multiple times a week for life. Haemophilia is rare. The two most common types are haemophilia A, a lack of factor 8, and haemophilia B, a lack of factor 9.
I'm not sure how far back in our family it all started, but I do know that my grandfather and his brothers had haemophilia. I never got to meet him because he died young of a stomach bleed, but he was an amazing man. He never let his bleeding disorder get to him. He was in the age where there were different treatments. Unfortunately, he died the year before better treatments were available. He passed the condition on to my mum, and then my mum passed it on to me. For the first year of Lockie's life, we almost forgot that he had haemophilia. We didn't have any issues. But once he turned 1, things changed.
He went through the forest.
A few months before Lockie's first birthday, Shan returned to work and Lockie started daycare. As we expected, he caught every sickness under the sun. He never complained or whinged though, but one afternoon Shan picked Lockie up from daycare and he just would not stop crying. We all assumed it was just another daycare sickness. The next morning though, Lockie did a black poo.
I remembered back to my mum saying years ago that black poo could be the sign of internal bleeding, so we straight away called the hospital, but they said it shouldn't be anything to worry about. It could just be something that he'd eaten.
They said we could drop a sample in to be tested, which we did, and when that sample came back clear, we assumed that it must just be another virus. How wrong we were. Looking back on these photos now, I don't know how we could have ever thought that that's what it was. When Lockie vomited blood, we knew something was seriously wrong and had to get him to hospital as soon as we could. Once we got Lockie into emergency, the nurses took one look at him and rushed him straight through the doors. They needed to find a vein straight away to check his haemoglobin levels, and this is when the real trauma started. They couldn't get a cannula in. They tried 16 times, but his veins were just completely flat from blood loss.
They did finally get a small amount of blood to test his levels, and the results were shocking.
We knew he didn't look well, but when they started using words like resuscitate and life and death, we knew it was serious. His haemoglobin levels were dire. They were only 40 when they should be over 140.
The nurses told us if he was an adult, he wouldn't be alive. But this was just the beginning. He still needed an urgent blood transfusion and his life-saving factor treatment.
They pressed an emergency buzzer and people just came running from all directions.
Yeah, he had 2 people on each limb just desperately trying to find a vein, and they weren't being gentle. They knew they had to get a vein as soon as possible because his condition was deteriorating rapidly and he was continuing to throw up blood.
Thing that they had to do something, and they made the tough call of deciding to drill directly into his shin bone and transfusing the blood straight into his bone marrow. This was absolutely horrible to watch and pretty tough to listen to as well, but
it did work.
Thankfully it worked, and slowly his colour started returning to something a little bit more normal. This solved one problem, but he still needed his factor treatment, and this required a vein. So the searching continued, 2 people on each limb, desperately trying to find one that worked. We don't really know how long this took, but it felt like hours.
Finally, they were able to get a vein and get the factor into him. And once he had stabilised, we moved up to the intensive care unit.
We spent the night in intensive care and the next few days in hospital. Nobody could figure out what had caused his bleeding or why it was so severe. This is when we began to wonder whether Lockie was only mild, as his haematologist had said that he hadn't seen bleeding to that extent, even in severe cases.
Lockie's veins were all damaged from the trauma in emergency.
They just kept causing problems.
But eventually he was stable enough to go home.
Over the next 3 months, Lockie was back and forth to emergency. We now knew the early warning signs and were able to get him in before anything really bad happened. The hospital visits didn't seem to faze him too much. He loved playing with the cars and the toys. He became an expert at removing bandaging and ripping his lines out. This, combined with his veins still causing access issues, continued to make it tough to give him factor. He had a gastroscopy, which gave us no answers except that his stomach lining was really irritated. And the next step was a capsule endoscopy. A tiny camera was placed inside Lockie's stomach, and as it moved its way through his digestive system, it took a series of photos in the hope that it might show where his bleed was coming from.
Everything seemed to be going to plan, except we were told there was a bit of trauma when they put the capsule inside his stomach. But we spent the day in hospital, and eventually we were able to go home and put Lockie to bed.
Yeah, as soon as I came back downstairs, I just heard the most horrible noise and ran back up to check on Lockie. Nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. When the ambulance arrived, they couldn't believe the amount of blood that had come out of such a small child. They realised just how serious everything was, and they called for a special response unit to come and meet us and follow us to the hospital.
Yeah, I was in the back with Lockie, and it was a pretty gruesome sight. there was so much blood. He just kept vomiting and vomiting blood. He was dropping in and out of consciousness, and the special response unit had to come on board, so we had to pull over for them, and I just kept thinking, just get us to the hospital.
Yeah, I was in the front seat and I couldn't see anything, but I could hear everything that was going on, and I kind of felt that maybe made it worse. Felt completely helpless and absolutely terrified.
Yeah, I really thought that was it. He wasn't going to make it.
We still had the same access issues, and he just kept vomiting blood even when we were in the emergency room.
Yeah, but they did manage this time to get some factor and blood transfusions into him, and then we went straight back up to the intensive care unit.
We spent the next 5 days in hospital with Lockie on a constant infusion of factor. Trying to keep an almost 2-year-old entertained with a line in both ankles certainly had its challenges, but we tried to keep things as fun as possible for Lockie. Normally a treatment would be a one-off dose, but due to the severity of his bleed, Lockie was on this drip for 5 days. They determined that the insertion of the capsule was what had caused the trauma, which in turn meant we had no real answers, as most of the photos were obscured by bleeding.
We really wanted to try to turn this horrible situation into something positive.
We had to find out more, so we set out to learn as much about bleeding disorders as we could. We had a period of relative calm after the trauma of the capsule. Lockie had regular checkups at the hospital, and we kept him out of daycare to restrict exposure to sickness. When telling people about what Lockie had been through, we realised not many people even knew what bleeding disorders were. Many thought he would grow out of it, and others thought it was just a problem with cuts, and a lot had never heard of them. So we decided we'd like to try and change that and raise awareness. We felt that this would bring opportunities for more funding to go to research and hopefully one day a cure. We thought the best place to start would be to talk to organisations that support people with bleeding disorders and bring everyone along for the ride. World Federation of Haemophilia seemed like a great place to start. We thought it'd be amazing to speak with them, but would they want to talk to us? To our surprise, they did. In fact, everybody we contacted was happy to meet us. And so, a massive trip halfway around the world with an almost 2-year-old with a bleeding disorder sprang to life.
We went on a big adventure, but we almost didn't make it.
As Lockie is mild, he has his treatment on demand, so any bad bumps, bruises, or signs of bleeding, we have to get him to the hospital straight away. You can almost guarantee that when something important comes up, that's when something will happen. And you guessed it.
We're on the way to the hospital. Lockie has actually just fallen over and bashed his head into our bench top. It's huge. We're supposed to be leaving for the airport in the morning, so we're not actually sure whether this is going to happen. But look at you, little man. It's swelling up really fast. He's not happy, but hopefully if we get to hospital fast enough, we can get some factor in and still make it.
I'm up noggin too.
It was a bad bump and definitely needed at least one dose of factor. So our last day before the trip was spent in hospital. It was touch and go for a while, but luckily we were able to go home after a second dose of factor and spent the whole night packing ready for a very early start. We can't believe it, we made it. Are we getting on a big plane?
Big plane.
Yeah. Lockie loved his plane trip. Little did he realise there were plenty more to come. Over the coming weeks, we would be visiting organisations across the US and Canada. We landed in LA before heading across the country to the National Haemophilia Foundation in New York City.
Growing up, there was no clotting factor, so I was treated originally with whole blood. It really wasn't that effective. I spent months and days and weeks in the hospital.
Val has severe haemophilia B and has been involved in the haemophilia community for most of his life. In the early 1980s, thousands of people with haemophilia contracted HIV and hepatitis C after being exposed to contaminated clotting factor, which was sourced from tainted blood donations. Many passed the disease on to their wives and children, and sadly, thousands of people affected by this horrible event died. It was one of the biggest medical disasters ever and led to widespread changes in the screening of blood donations. Val himself was one of those affected, contracting HIV, hepatitis B and C. Val sadly lost his wife to HIV.
But she during her last days said, "You need to get on with your life, and I don't want you to, be in depression for the rest of your life because I'm gone." And I did exactly that.
Val helped people articulate their stories to Congress and was instrumental in getting compensation for the victims in America, a battle which is ongoing in other countries. These events were also the catalyst for better treatment for bleeding disorders and led to the development of the synthetic clotting factors still used today.
The reason your blood supply is safe is because of people with bleeding disorders. If we hadn't been infected with HIV in the 1980s, many more of you would have died of AIDS or blood-borne diseases. That's why the blood supply is safe. And I don't need all the money you have. I need every person in the United States to give us $1. If everybody gave us $1, we can cure hemophilia.
Next stop, Washington, D.C. The US healthcare system is complex and very different to Australia, though we do face some of the same challenges.
I would say our biggest challenge right now is that, hemophilia is not well known, and so just education. Educating everybody from members of Congress down to ER. There's a lot of turnover in ERs, so one of the things we think about is how do you get people, even doctors who might not be familiar, to understand what a bleeding disorder is. So I would say that just education of the outside public is probably our biggest challenge.
Haemophilia treatment is expensive, and even somewhere like the US, people struggle to get the treatment they need, so having an organisation to advocate for them is vital.
Without health insurance, it's almost impossible to take care of a person with a bleeding disorders. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder. People get this through no fault of their own and deserve to have access to healthcare and access to insurance.
Even in a first world country like America, life with a bleeding disorder can be tough. So you can only imagine what it's like for those in developing countries, something we were about to find out as we visited the World Federation of Haemophilia. We left America and headed to Montreal, Canada on a tight schedule. Our whole trip was planned around this very important visit, so everything had to go right. Which of course means that everything went wrong. Flights, traffic, accommodation, lost luggage and technical difficulties almost completely derailed us, but we made it to WFH just in time. WFH's vision is treatment for all, and while doing our research, we were shocked to discover that somewhere around 75% of people worldwide have either inadequate or no access to treatment.
From the 75%, many of them don't even live. They don't come to an age that they could get any treatment or be diagnosed. So the biggest challenge we see is diagnosis in the world. We don't know where the patients are. And because it's a rare disease, we don't know, some of the countries just don't have that on their radar screen.
WFH works with developing countries through their humanitarian aid program, getting people the treatment that they need to survive and giving them hope for the future.
When you go in some African countries and you see patients that have not been treated, and you see how those patients live or don't live, because at 10 they can't walk. Right? And that when you provide a minimum support and when you provide some products to be treated, you can have someone who has almost a normal life. So we know that when the right things are put in place, first patient get treated, and that they live a normal life, a good life, a normal life. And this is something we really can also show to governments and say, look, if you invest in hemophilia, if you invest in the structure, if you invest in diagnosis, if you invest in product, you will have people who are, really can contribute to society and do fantastic things.
Speaking with WFH really brought home how important their work is. We're inspired by how they're saving people's lives and became determined to help spread their message. The next day, a stress-free walk across Montreal brought us to the beautiful grounds of McGill University and the Canadian Haemophilia Society.
People have to remember this is a very serious disease. Untreated, it's a fatal disease. Untreated, most people will die before the age of 20. Those that survive will have terribly damaged joints. And that goes for mild, moderate, and severe patients.
We asked how CHS faces the challenges that all of these organisations seem to deal with. As bleeding disorders are rare, funding and resources are limited. But how do we improve this and get people to care about bleeding disorders?
We appreciate the generosity of the public, but we don't have a lot of support anymore. We used to, during the tainted blood tragedy of the 1990s, when we were on the front page of the newspapers, we had a lot of public support. It's a rare disease, and that support has dwindled away. We're not in the news anymore, which is a good thing. We know hemophilia and other inherited bleeding disorders are genetic diseases, and so people might think, well, it doesn't affect me. I don't have it in my family. But about a third, if not more, of each case is a new genetic mutation. So these diseases can affect any family, without warning. So it really is, everybody's issue, not just people who are already affected.
Our time in Canada was at an end, but we were so grateful for the experience and the knowledge that we had gained. Back on another plane, bound for LA, and a visit to the Haemophilia Foundation of Southern California, which represents 10% of all America's bleeding disorder population. We were amazed at the huge variety of programs and events that support this large and multicultural community.
We do probably about 7 or 8 major events every year, coupled with smaller programs. We have our camp. I think every foundation across the country does a summer camp, which is a medically staffed camp. Our goal there is to provide a safe place where the kids can feel comfortable being with similarly situated peers. And last year I was really proud that we achieved our record Big Stick Award winners, which means that the kids learn to successfully self-infuse. And so, as you know, it's like teaching your 2-year-old how to swim because you want them to be safe in the water. For us, we are very passionate about this issue because if they're in a place where nobody knows how to access a vein, it is life-saving. It's like learning how to swim.
We felt an instant connection with Michelle, as she's also a passionate parent of a child with a bleeding disorder. She gave us so much inspiration and some great ideas on ways that we can support the bleeding disorders community and get the public involved.
It's hard to get people engaged in a condition that they have no relation to. A lot of times I also say, how many people here have ever gotten a flu shot and your kid freaked out? How about a blood draw? How about if you had to do that to your child, age 3 times a week just to keep them alive?
This amazing and rewarding experience had come to an end. We headed home feeling empowered and more connected than we thought possible. People on the other side of the world welcomed us with open arms and shared so much of their time and knowledge. It was an incredible feeling to be part of such an inclusive and supportive community. But what next? We've been extremely busy, both of us studying, working full-time and keeping Lockie out of mischief. But we came away from our trip eager to continue our project and keep the momentum going. We've met some amazing people within the bleeding disorders community in Australia. We've heard incredible stories that are yet to be told, and they will be as part of an even bigger project in the future. We've gotten more involved with our local foundation, going along to our first camp and establishing an annual community event. We were blown away by the support and know that it will only get bigger next year. And Lockie, how's he? Well, we never did find out what was causing his bleeds, but we are incredibly thankful that he has had a period of really good health. That doesn't stop us from remaining vigilant and on top of any injuries, but he is living life to the fullest. Our biggest news is that any day now, Lockie is going to be a big brother. This was a massive decision for us after everything we've been through. We had a round of IVF to rule out the possibility of having another child with haemophilia. However, after problems with testing, just as we were about to start another round, fate intervened and Shan discovered she was pregnant naturally. It's been an anxious wait as we found out we're having another boy. Lockie is super excited. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know whether Lockie will have more mystery bleeds. We don't know whether his little brother will have haemophilia. What we do know is that we can now handle whatever challenges might be thrown at us. There are some exciting new treatments on the horizon and we're optimistic for the future, not just for Lockie but for everyone with a bleeding disorder. There's still a long way to go and some work to be done, but we love a challenge and we've only just begun.
Thanks for watching. Mwah.